when I was about 2, my father stabbed my mom behind the ear. They got into a fight. He stabbed her behind the ear and he went to prison. Well, my mom had a porn collection, and at 5 years old, I found porn. My mom had always smoked weed and drank liquor and always partied, but she became very abusive. I remember seeing my sister's head snap back against the wall. Boom. My mom hits her probably 2 or 3 more times. I walked home from school one day I wasn't supposed to. So I get home late. My mom's real mad. And instead of her being like, thankfully you're home and you're safe, it was like, where the So I go upstairs to get a whooping. She had this like big wooden paddle that she would use. It's like a 2x4 with a handle carved into it. We got this new friend. His name's Mondo, we called him. He's in his 30s. Yeah, he's like 32, 33 probably. He basically, his hand drops off my hip, touches my butt. Really callous, rough hands. And I always remember what his hands feel like. I knew everything was wrong. I knew everything he was doing to me was wrong. Probably talking 300 to 400 occasions of abuse because I was going to his house every weekend of the year. Yeah, there's no sense in me having or harboring anger and hate towards somebody.
Why don't we just start from the top? Where does your story begin? And why don't we just start there? Where does your story even begin?
Yeah. If you have any questions, just stop me and ask. I encourage any and all questions. I think I just recently saw somebody say this, that there are questions that we shouldn't ask. We shouldn't ask, quote unquote, survivors because of the victim blaming and shaming kind of thing. So if there's a question you have, just ask, because I know there are questions and I am able to answer them without any judgment, So I'll say that first and we'll get into it. So I was born and raised in Ohio, Northwest Ohio. I was born and raised in Lima. I was born to a mom. She had me and my 2 sisters by the time she was like 19 or 20, and we're all back to back. So we're all 1 year apart, basically. And when I was about 2, my father stabbed my mom behind the ear. They got into a fight. He stabbed her behind the ear, and he went to prison. So I never knew my father growing up. I have some pictures of us around that time, but you don't remember those days. And especially when you have a adverse childhood, you forget a lot of it. And I have to actively journal and things like that to remember some of these things. I don't remember that incident. Some incidents later in life. But my father goes to prison when I was about 2. So I grew up without a father, single mother, 3 kids, probably doing the best that she could. She wasn't raised right as well, I don't believe. And as I've learned more, that probably removed some of her maternal instincts, which is really crazy to think about. But as I got older, maybe 3, 4, 5 years old, I remember we were always at babysitters' houses. We were always somewhere, and she was always working. We really didn't see her too much. We were raising ourselves. When I was old enough or big enough to stand on a chair and reach the sink or the microwave, we were cooking our own food, doing our own laundry at 5 years old, And around that time, I was staying with a babysitter. They had like 4 or 5 kids. One of them was a teenage boy, and unfortunately, he was probably damaged in some form or fashion, and he ended up reciprocating that to me, right? Which was, he ended up molesting me when I was about 5 years old.
How old was he?
He was in his teens. He was probably 14, 15, 16. The only frame of reference in regarding to time that I have, or his age, is I know he looked like a grown man. I'll say that, he exposed himself to me, and then he made me, he looked at me as well, I don't remember a whole lot about that. I know it happened a few times, and, he touched me, I touched him, and I just remember that he did not look like me, so being that I was only 5. And so that happened, and we ended up telling my grandparents about it. We would go see my grandparents occasionally, and I think that they tried to report, or they tried to do something. They tried to protect us because it stopped. Nothing ever happened, but it it stopped. I don't think it ever continued past that. So around that same time, once again, I was living in this apartment complex, and my mom was always working. So she worked during the day so she could be with us at night. So we'd come home from school and we'd have the house to ourselves. We did our chores, and then we went outside and played. Well, my mom had a porn collection, and at 5 years old, I found porn and started watching it.
At 5?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And for those who don't realize how detrimental that is, I would encourage you to read and do some research on it. But it is incredibly detrimental to a child's brain. I mean, it's really bad. And started watching porn and took it out in the neighborhood, was showing the neighborhood kids, all this really bad shit. In fact, maybe in that time from 5 to 6, I actually tried to have sex with a girl in my closet at my house. She was my age. And I tried to have sex with her. My mom ended up catching us. She kicks the door open and she yells at us, and she ends up beating the hell out of me for that. And kind of rightfully so, but also I was only doing what I thought was...
It's what you saw.
Yeah, it's what I saw. I was just kind of... I knew it was wrong, but it's like, you saw it, and I thought this is what you can do sometimes. So I briefly remember that, but I remember that. And that kind of plays into what happens later. A few years go by, we're bouncing around houses, we're always moving, I'm always going to different schools. I never went to a school from the beginning of the year to the end of the year and stayed in one school for the entire year. We always moved. My mom couldn't pay rent, had to get a new job, whatever it was. We were always moving. And around like 9, 10 years old, that's kind of when things really flipped a switch in my life. My mom had always smoked weed and drank liquor and always partied. We always had people at the house smoking and drinking and partying. It was always like a thing. But around 9, 10 years old, I don't know if the last nerve was burnt up or what, but she became very abusive. Emotionally, physically, verbally.
She hadn't been like that until 10.
Right. Yeah. I wouldn't say abusive. She was probably neglectful. Which, oddly enough, even just neglect, unwilling neglect or unknowingly neglecting your children is incredibly detrimental as well. So you don't even have to abuse your child, but just neglecting them of love and compassion and affection will actually play a massive role in who they are as a child. And so around this time, she started to get more physical, basically. She'd always done the neglect and the verbal stuff, but she became very physical. And, one day I was sitting in my bedroom and I'm playing video games, and my older sister walked in and she sat down next to me. She's venting because her and my younger sister just got into a fight. And I'm sitting here playing the games. My sister's off to my left. There's a wall, and she's got her back against the wall. Right next to her is the door. My younger sister's in another room crying. My mom kicks open this door suddenly, abruptly. I turn, look over, and my mom, like hammer fist style, takes her hand and just punches my sister in the face. And this memory is so like traumatic, I guess, because my sister had a sucker in her mouth. So my initial thought was she's going to like knock this thing down her throat or she's going to knock her teeth out. But she hits her in the face. Luckily, none of that happens. I remember seeing my sister's head snap back against the wall. Boom. My mom hits her probably 2 or 3 more times. And in that outburst, I jumped on the other side of my bed. And at 10 years old, 19 years old, I was like hiding behind my bed, looking up at my mom. And I'm like, I'm crying. And she looks at me verbatim and says, "What are you fucking crying about? Stop being a fucking bitch." And I didn't have a father in my life. My mom is the only one who's there for me. So those moments, it just ruins your brain and your heart. It removes any like ounce of compassion, empathy, or love that you might have in a little child, And so around that time, I became very disassociated probably with my own feelings. You know, you have to learn how to survive at a young age when those things are happening. I became very depressed and suicidal. You know, I often thought about killing myself.
At 10.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I was scared. I was scared of the pain. I thought about drowning myself, cutting myself, jumping from my roof. I would always look. I had this window. I would look out and I would think about, like, if I land just right, I'll break my neck. And if I don't, it's going to hurt like hell and I'm going to be stuck in a wheelchair or something. Like, that's honestly like my rationale at 10 years old. And yeah. So life continues. Another bad example would be I walked home from school one day I wasn't supposed to. And walking home, I also took my sweet time because me and my friends were playing around. So I get home late. My mom's real mad. And instead of her being like, thankfully you're home and you're safe, it was like, where the fuck have you been? Go to my fucking room. So I go upstairs to get a whooping. She had this like big wooden paddle that she would use. It's like a 2x4 with a handle carved into it. And I go up to our bed. I lay across the bed, grab the blankets, you know, and that was like standard practice for butt whoopings. But I always grab the blankets because if you try to protect yourself, she was just going to keep swinging, you know. So if you try to pull your hand back to cover your butt, she's just going to keep swinging. So you might as well just take them on the butt and go. And most of the time, this wasn't that bad. Like, it was just a couple cracks and you were good. And I remember being there hanging onto the sheets or her blankets, and she hit me. The first time she hit me, I bounced off the bed so hard, I fell down to my knees. She keeps swinging. And so she's hitting me in my back at this point. And she hit me across the back 3, 4, 5 times with this wooden board. You know, and I don't remember the pain anymore, but I remember, like, obviously it hurt like hell, and I fall to the floor, and I'm laying there screaming and crying. I'm probably more destroyed that my mom just did this to me, unrelenting, than it was even the physical pieces of it, you know?
Can you feel the rage?
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's what you feel, right? That's what I feel now, right? I can remember, like, the animosity, the rage that was in the room, the tension of, like, just being feared, you know? Like, it just sucked. She was so mad, you know? And I was just like, all I did was walk from school. I'm sorry. Like, I was okay with the butt whooping, but this was just too much, you know? And so I was laying on the floor, and once again, verbatim, she looks at me and she says, you know, get the fuck out of here. Go to your fucking room. So I go to my room. I'm laying there without my shirt on, crying. She never comes up to console me, never apologizes, never tells me she loves me. The only person who checked on me was her boyfriend at the time. He came up and put a bag of ice on my back. I ended up going to school, and I ended up showing I was a part of the Big Brother, Big Sister program. I had a big brother, you know. I was a troubled kid, and they knew it. And so I had this big brother. He was in high school or college maybe. And I remember showing him my back. And what's crazy about kids in these situations is they'll do things to get your attention, but then once they get it, they'll like back off. And this is what I was doing. So I showed this kid my back, and I had like 4 like stamped red marks across my back, you know, from this board. And he asked me questions about it, and I was like, oh, I got jumped, and somebody knocked me off my bike and was hitting me with a wooden board.
You wanted him to know, but you didn't want him to know.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so hard to help these kids, because I was also, at the same time, I was also being interviewed by Children Protective Services quite often in school. And my mom knew that was happening. I think we either told her or we told her, hey, no, somebody talked to us today. And she would always tell us what happens in our house stays in our house, and it's none of their business. So at 8, 9, 10 years old, I was talking to these people that are trying to protect me and help me, and I was telling them it's none of your business what happens in my house. You know, so you can imagine how hard it is to help kids when they don't even want, not that they don't want to, but they don't understand that they need to protect themselves and help themselves. You know, when a child is going through these moments in life, they feel compelled to protect their abuser. they're whoever it is, whatever the situation may be, even in an adult, even in domestic violence situations, So that's what I was doing. I was protecting my mom. I didn't want her to get in trouble despite all the shit that she was putting us through. And it just gets worse and worse and worse. And around this time, about 10 years old, I meet this kid. He's a friend of mine. His name's fake name for the story to protect him, but we'll call him Jacob for the sake of this podcast. And I meet Jacob. Jacob lives around the corner from me. He's like 5 years older than me, 4 or 5 years older than me. And I start hanging out with him. He knows I have a jacked up life at home, which is why he lets me hang out with him. And so he's letting me come over, play video games, spend the night, have fun with him. I was hanging out with his friends, and he's protecting me, and he was awesome. I'm still connected with him today, and I love him to death. So one day I'm over at Jacob's house, and this man walks in the front door. This man's 6'8", 380 pounds, Hispanic guy. He's very pale, but you can tell he's Hispanic. He's got the Dahmer, like, serial killer style glasses on, long, black, slick back hair. And I remember the guy was just massive. He looked like a left tackle. I mean, dude was just huge. And he didn't look sloppy. He looked like he could throw a hard punch, is what I always tell people. And he walks in, and he introduces himself to me. And the first thing he does is he builds some commonality with me. So he says, "You like video games?" I love video games. I was playing Madden and NCAA and Halo 2 at the time. And I'm like, "Yeah, I love video games." He's like, "Oh, cool." He's like, "You like football?" "Yeah, I love football. I love the Buckeyes. I love the Browns." "Cool, me too." So he says, "Well, why don't you come up to my house with me and play video games with me and Jacob?" So I said, "Well, okay, let me go home and ask my mom." So I go home, ask my mom. My mom says, "As long as you're with Jacob, that's fine." And I'd been hanging out with Jacob now for a month or two, maybe 3 months. And, I go up to his house. I remember getting in his car, and that was the first time I had been in a car that had AC, which was like, as a kid, you're like, "Oh, finally, like, it's not hot as hell in the car," We go to this chicken place in my hometown, famous chicken place. We get some chicken, and I could get whatever I wanted. I could get the 8-piece chicken tenders and a pop and mac and cheese and fries. And I'm in the back seat. I'm like, dude, this is awesome. Because my mom, single mom on welfare, we don't get these things.
This is what the good life is like.
Yeah, this is the good life, man. Yeah. So I'm like, hell yeah, dude. So, like, we're going up to his house. It's like a 30-minute drive. We'll listen to Metallica, AC/DC. He's got this, like, banging system in his car. And I'm just like, dude, like, this is fucking awesome, man. Yeah. I'm with my friend Jacob. We got this new friend. His name's Mondo, we called him. And I'm like, dude, this is going to be sick. So we go up to his house, and he lives in the studio, this big studio. And you walk in, and it's dark. It's about a 9-foot ceiling. There's acoustical ceiling tiles. The 2x4 fluorescent lights in the ceiling. And I look to my right. There's this entertainment center. There's 2 or 3 TVs. There's 2 or 3 game systems, like 2 Xboxes, 3 Xboxes maybe. So point being is that the first thing I'm thinking is, like, we don't have to take turns. Like, we can all just play video games together, And so I'm like, dude, this is fucking sick. There's 2 computers in the back, 2 desktops. We play a lot of computer games as well. There's a big table in the middle of the room. We played, like, Dungeons and Dragons as well. And so that was his whole setup in the middle of the room. Kitchen in the back, bathroom. And then there in the back left corner, there was this black sheet that hung from the ceiling. And it was just kind of like stapled or tied into the ceiling tiles above. And it kind of boxed off the left corner. And that's where his bedroom was. So there was no physical walls in this place. It was just sheets hanging up around his bed. And there's trash everywhere. Like, so much clutter, so much trash, pizza boxes, pop, bottles, all this shit, right? But I didn't really give a shit. I was like, whatever, dude, I'm here to play video games and like have a good time, know?
And I don't have to take turns.
Exactly. I don't have to take turns, right? So, and his fridge has got pop, and we ended up getting pizza that night. And so you get like 3 or 4 pizzas, pop, no rules. You can stay up as late as you want. Like, I did not go to sleep. I played video games for like 18 hours straight. I was it was awesome. So we're hanging out, boom. We go home on a Sunday, and, he's like, well, I'm like, man, I want to go back like next weekend, you know?
And you had fun, and there was nothing wrong with it.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, I mean, so I slept on the couch. I either slept on the couch or there was like one of those like rollout pad things that I slept behind the couch. And my friend Jacob, who's older than me, I remember him going back and sleeping in the guy's bed with him. And to me, I was just like, whatever. Like, it would be the same as me going back and sleeping with Jacob. Like, boys, whenever we have sleepovers, we sleep together sometimes. Not a big deal. That's what I thought. So I go home, and, you know, Mondo's like, well, when do you want to come back? And I'm like, I'll come back whenever, you know. And
how old was Mondo?
He's in his 30s. Yeah, he's like 32, 33 probably.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm like, you know, I'll come back whenever. And so I end up going back to his house the next weekend, and I keep going back to his house every weekend. And during this time, my mom is progressively getting worse. And my mom eventually gets into, she ends up meeting a new boyfriend. We move to a new house, and she gets addicted to crack and cocaine. And at the same time, we move into this new house. There were many times we didn't have utilities, you know. We didn't have power or gas or whatever it was to keep, you know. I remember having to boil my bath water, for example, and going up there and dumping the hot water in the tub, stuff like that, which, you know, that's really not that bad, but it just kind of gives perspective on those kind of things. So anyways, we were living in this house, and I remember when we got there, I went upstairs to look at my room, you know, and just to be clear, at this point, you know, I was struggling bad. I was getting bullied at school. You know, my mom was mean. And so the only escape I had from this life was going to Mondo's house. And the reason why I say that is I go up to this room. This is my bedroom, right? And it's got hardwood floors. The floors are buckled all the way across. They're cracked, buckled, split. It's like literally hard to walk across the floors. And it smells like cat piss or like dog piss and shit. Supposedly the people that had lived there before had 2 or 3, 4 dogs, and they were just locked in that room. So that was my room. To make matters worse, there was a hole in the ceiling that was about 2 feet wide and 4 feet deep. I could literally see into the attic structure above. There was no insulation. You know, there was just nothing. There was just this hole, and I could see the attic. And so when it rained, the rain would come right into my room, which is the reason why the floors were so damaged, you know, from the moisture and everything. And I slept on a little 3-4-inch mattress that was laid right on the floor. Had a thin little blanket, wet the bed every night, freezing cold in that room every single night.
Ohio winters are.
Yeah.
And you was not from Ohio.
Yeah.
It gets cold up there.
Right. Yeah. So the cold wind would just like whip into my room, and it was just miserable, man. It was a miserable experience. And so I keep hanging out with Mondo. You know, over the course of about 3 months, I start telling him about my life, right? Where I'm like, I think my mom's using drugs and like hard drugs, and my mom is abusive. She punches us sometimes. She grabs us sometimes. She's not with us. She doesn't love us, things like that. And he starts to disclose the same information about his mom and his childhood. He starts to tell me that his mom was abusive. His mom didn't love him. He grew up with a bunch of sisters, but he was like the outcast. And he would tell me, you know, he didn't have a father in his life. So we had all these commonalities, right? So naturally, as a child, I wanted to be with this guy because he understood me. You know, there was nobody else who understood me the way that he did. And so we start having like very adult-like conversations. We would talk about politics. We would talk about all of these different, like some very high-level conversations for a 10, 11, 12-year-old kid to have, which is a sign that something is happening. When you hear children having conversations about like something that maybe a 5-year-old shouldn't be talking about politics. When you hear that, or you hear that some sort of, they say big words sometimes, that's kind of a clue that somebody's talking to them. Somebody's saying something to them, and it could be good. It's not always bad, but that's just a sign to pay attention to. And at the time, that's what was happening with me, is I was having all these educated conversations with him. And, you know, lo and behold, about 3 months into knowing him, 3 or 4 months into knowing him, I'm at his house, and Jacob's actually up there that weekend. It was on a Sunday. Jacob goes to get tacos down the street. So he comes back. While Jacob's gone, I was sitting in Mondo's lap. And, you know, he's this real big guy. I was this tiny little kid. I was sitting in his lap because it was always freezing cold in his studio. And so I remember one day he was just kind of like, well, if you're cold, why don't you come up here and sit with me? He had a blanket. So I would sit with him. He'd cover me up with a blanket, and it was nice and warm. And truly, it just felt good. Like I was like cuddling up, snuggling up with somebody.
Yeah.
As odd as that sounds as a 10-year-old boy and a grown man. But like my children, when I go home today, they come and cuddle and snuggle up with me. You know what I'm saying? So they're probably not longing for that from anybody else because they get it from daddy or mommy. And I never had that in my life. Never. So to sit there with him felt good. And when this was happening, he had his left hand on my left hip, big, massive hands. I remember his hands. He had long nails. He had very calloused hands. His knuckles were so calloused, he could take his fingers and rub them together, and it would sound like you're rubbing rocks. And he would always do that. He'd always rub his knuckles together, and it just sounded like you're rubbing rocks, So his hands were just really calloused, rough hands. And I always remember what his hands feel like, because of what happens. And he basically, his hand drops off my hip, touches my butt, and he apologizes. And I said, "No, it's not a big deal." I figured it was like me and you bumping each other in the hallway,
Yeah.
Not a big deal, man. Don't worry about it. So he puts his hand back on my butt, and he says, "So this is okay." And at that moment, I froze, which is exactly what they want out of the child. They want them to freeze because the child doesn't immediately say no. Therefore, they have consented at that point, right? In their minds, and they know what they're doing. They know that it's not consent, but they know that if the child doesn't say no or stop right away, they've got him. It's like setting the hook on a fish.
It's like testing.
Yeah, exactly. And he got me. I didn't say no right away. And so what'll happen is Jacob pulls up to the house. He takes his hand off. I go home. Don't think anything of it. I was kind of like, I knew when he put his hand back on my butt, I knew where it was going. And I was kind of like, shit, like, here we go, I kind of tell people it's like being at the top of the roller coaster. And you hear that last click and you kind of look down and you're like, oh, shit. That's kind of how I felt. Like that, you're like sick to your stomach, And Jacob pulls up. He moves his hand off. I go home. I'm like, maybe nothing's going to happen, I'll go back. It's not a big deal. We're playing video games, eating pizza. I'm probably overthinking this. You're like gaslighting yourself, thinking that it's not going to happen,
You want it to be, what you thought it would be.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is, you want to have someone that cares, someone that loves you. You want to have friends to hang out with. You want the perks of being there, which is the video games and pizza and pop. Do you think that when he was telling these stories to you and having these conversations, and he said, I had a very similar childhood, do you think those were real stories, or do you think he made up those stories to connect with you?
That's a good question. I've thought about that a lot over the years. I don't know if they're true or not. I met his mom knowing him pretty quick. I met his mom within like a month of knowing him. And I had real long hair at the time. I had real long hair down to my shoulders. And his mom actually told me I was too pretty to be a boy when she first met me. And I did look like a little girl, admittedly. But I met his mom. I met his sisters. I knew his whole family. I would go to family events with him and outings, his Thanksgivings, his Christmases, because I didn't have much of a family. So I would go with him. It was more enjoyable than mine. And his whole family was good and put together. His sisters were all relatively successful. They were living happy, meaningful lives. They had families with children and all those things. And he was the only one that didn't. He was the only one that was alone and single and, living that life. I have not talked to his family since. I would love to. I'd love to talk to them and sit down with them and connect with them and ask him, like, what was he like growing up? Like, what was going on? Like, what do you think led him down this path, Because I don't know. And these people are absolutely monsters, right? But at some point, he was a child. He was a baby. And he knew nothing but good things in this world.
Yeah.
And then something happened. And then another thing happened. And then another thing happened that twisted his brain into doing what he would eventually end up doing, right? And I'm not defending him. I'm just there was a point where he was innocent and then he wasn't, and I don't know what that was. I don't know if those stories were true or if he was trying to manipulate me, because that's what they are. They're just, pedophiles are masters of deception. They are incredibly coercive and deceptive and persuasive, whatever whatever you want to call it. So I don't know if they were true or not, I'd have to talk to his family about that, so, which I haven't been able to. So I'm open to it, but I just can't find him. So anyways, I go back to his house, keep going back to his house. And basically from this point forward, at 10 years old, it progressively gets worse and worse and worse every weekend. The most simple way I can explain it is like when you're dating somebody in college, right? You go out to dinner, then you go out to dinner and a movie, and then you go out to dinner and a movie and you get a hug, and then it's a dinner, movie, hug, and a kiss, and then it's going back to my place, and then it's, there's these steps that you take in a relationship, and that's kind of what he was doing with me. So, a couple weeks later, I'm at his house again, and I actually just remembered this detail because I was going through the police reports. I was up at his house, and I remember he called me back. It was either called me back to his bed or he did it on his chair, but I was standing there and he just ripped my shorts down suddenly, out of nowhere. He just pulls my shorts and underwear down and it exposes me, right? I was embarrassed. I pull up my shorts right away, start crying. I'm just standing there crying and scared. And he did this, I'm sure, because he knew that it would hurt me, probably. He knew that it would be embarrassing. And I didn't have anywhere to go. I was already at his house. So who am I going to call? Who am I going to talk to? Who am I going to console or confide in? It's him, right? Because he's the only one there. So he rips my shorts down. I start crying. I pull him up. And he's like, well, he's like, hey, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do that, So it's like beating a dog and then giving them a treat, You're messing with the psychology of that person. And he knew what he was doing, so he says, I'm sorry, and he holds me and hugs me, and that may have been the first time he told me that he loved me. And so things just keep getting worse and worse and worse.
What does that feel like with your mom not telling you that she loves you, and all of a sudden this guy says, I love you?
Confusing, man. It's very, very confusing. Your brain actually doesn't understand the difference between love and attention. So your brain confuses attention with love and love with attention sometimes. So I remember when he said it, I was kind of like, I don't know if I told him right there, but I would eventually end up telling him I loved him too. And he would guilt me we went through a lot of guilt tripping, a lot of that where, he would eventually end up telling me that he loved me. I was the most important thing to him in the world. He was going to kill himself if it was not for me, and on the same token, he knew that I wanted to kill myself. He knew that I was very suicidal. And so he would coach me through life as to not, don't kill yourself. I'm here for you. And if you kill yourself, then I'm not going to have a reason to live. So at 10, 11, 12 years old, I'm navigating all of these emotions with a grown man, which is tough. And he, so I started reciprocating the same feelings, but as the time goes on, he progressively does more and more, right? So he's touching me. Then eventually he starts sticking his hand in my shorts and my pants. He starts trying to use his hands on me. One of the more haunting details, I guess, is he had long fingernails, and I remember him trying to use his fingers on me. And I told him, no, it hurts, first off, and then he's like, well, what's wrong? And I said, well, your nail hurts, So I came back the next weekend, and he had trimmed his nail for me, So it's like this, people don't understand. This is the reason why I think these details are important, is because people think it's this innocent touching, right? Or petting of a child. And it's like, these guys are doing malicious, brutal things to children. And because you don't want to acknowledge it, it's going to keep happening. Like I talked about with the ACE study, We know what child abuse, neglect, and trauma is doing to children and is doing to adults. Yet we still have the same amount of abuse, trauma, and neglect going on. Therefore, there's literally almost nothing being done to end this perpetuated violence, right? So he starts doing stuff like that. He's using his fingers on me all of a sudden. And then, he starts kissing me, and he's making me kiss him back. And I remember laying in his bed with him for just hours and hours and hours. It was miserable. And there was no clock back there. So I had like no frame of reference for time. Like, how long do I have, I kind of talk about him like he was like a dog and he wanted to be fed. And when he was fed, he was good, so he eventually starts touching me more. He moves on to oral sex. He's performing oral sex on me, and then he's making me do it to him. And, about 12 years old or so, I start going through puberty. He starts talking about my body's changing, and he's like almost proud of it. He's like really happy and excited for me in a way. And I remember him performing oral sex one night, and I end up having my first orgasm with this grown man. And I remember him looking up at me like, the next thing he says to me, is he's like, "Did you enjoy that?" And I'm looking down at him, and what am I going to say? Yes. So he's super proud of himself, And I'm laying there, and that's just so difficult to go through because on Monday I was back in school. I'm going back to school like a normal kid, Straight A student, pretty much a perfect kid in school, aside from getting in some fights. I think some teachers probably thought I had some sort of opposition disorder, which is like ODD, oppositional defiance disorder, which is like kids who just don't behave, don't listen to authority, or ADD, stuff like that. It's actually incredibly overdiagnosed because the symptoms of ODD, ADD are almost exactly the symptoms of dissociative like disorders and trauma. So teachers are diagnosing children with all these diseases or these disorders. In reality, they're looking at the psychology of it. They're looking at what is happening. What is this child doing? What is their brain doing? What are they doing in the school? Versus the physiological aspect of it, which is what is happening to them, right? Why are they acting like this? What is happening outside of school that they can't pay attention, or that they're oppositional defiant disorder, right? Like me, where I was always fighting with my teachers. I was always the class clown. I was always looking to get in trouble, I was never diagnosed with anything, but Monday through Friday in school, that's who I was. I was that kid who was getting in trouble a lot. Even though I had perfect grades, I was a really smart kid. I got into a lot of trouble. So, my friends, what do they do on the weekend? They were probably with their family doing fun things and all that. And they would ask me what I did on the weekend. Well, I hung out with a friend of mine. What am I going to say, And I hit it. I hit it all. And me and Mondo, we had a code of conduct. I wouldn't say anything outside of that. He wouldn't say anything. When I was with him and his family, we didn't talk about anything. I didn't sit in his lap. We hid the affection, right? And he had me like a little puppet on a string, and keep going back, and life at home is getting worse and worse and worse, to the point where every single day there's probably 10, 15, 20 people coming in and out of my house to use drugs. They would go to the bathroom for 5, 6, 7, 8 hours a day, getting high, and then one day, it's kind of crazy. I was over at my neighbor's house. I don't know why. I walked in my neighbor's house and my sisters were in there, and they're watching a show called Intervention. I don't know if you remember that show. It was back out in the early 2000s or whatever, and it was about people who had a family member who was addicted or has some sort of addiction problems, right? And so they surprise them with a surprise intervention, And at the end of every episode, they would say, if you know somebody, here's our contact, here's our mailing address and email. If you know somebody, reach out to us. And so me and my sisters are looking at each other, and we're like, oh shit, like we should get mom on the show and see if they'll come and help her. Shit you not, man. Walk outside, there's a fire in my front yard next door. And immediately go into a panic, right? Because I'm like, what the hell's going on? My mom's boyfriend walks out on the front porch. He's got blood all over his shirt. My mom comes out. She's yelling and screaming. Very violent moment. Cops pull up. They put her in the back of the car. And 12 years old, I walk out to the car and I'm looking at my mom in the back seat. And she's, an inch from me through the glass. But it feels like she's a mile away. She's so far away from me. And I can almost see it playing out as it was going on, almost like a third person camera from above, like watching this whole thing happen with this little boy screaming and crying and beating on this police car window for his mom. I couldn't even talk, and I was just screaming and crying, and my mom is in the car and she's like, it's going to be okay. I'm going to come and get you. I love you. And she's gone. So I go into my house, cops in there, we have some family members that are there, and they're like, what are we going to do with the kids? Somehow my dad ends up in the picture. He finds out that this happened, and he ends up at my house. The cops say, okay, they're going to go with the dad, right? So we move in with my dad about 45 minutes away, an hour away from my hometown. And I was living there for a little while, got into a bunch of trouble at school. This is textbook trauma, trauma child, right? I go to this school. I'm once again getting in trouble. My grades actually dropped tremendously. Went from being a straight A student to almost straight Fs. I ended up in alternative school for slapping the principal. He put his hands on me, and I turned around and slapped him. Got into a bunch of trouble. Principal told me I was going to end up in juvie if I kept doing what I was doing. Nobody tried to help me, I had a teacher who, on a Saturday school, told me to write about my summer. Well, I'm not, and the thing was I was manipulating them as well. I was smart enough to know that I could have wrote anything about my summer, you know what I'm saying? But I was like, fuck you, I'm not writing about my summer. Like, you want to know about my summer? Like, you really don't, because of what was happening to me, And I was smart enough to know what I was doing. I was manipulating them, I wanted that attention. I wanted them to know why I couldn't write about my summer, And they didn't. They didn't care to ask, They just, and I don't know if I would have told them, but they took me out in the hallway and they yelled at me, and that was the end of it.
You're almost crying for help.
Exactly. The same way I was previously, where I had told the big brother, like, look at my back. I'm like, it's that cry for help. And you get so close to getting help, and then it's like, okay, never mind, I don't want it. But this teacher didn't even offer it, They just attributed it to me being an asshole of a kid. And so I ended up going to alternative school, and they told me if I got in trouble again, I was going to go to juvie. So I told my dad, I was like, I can't stay here. Like, I've got to go back to my hometown where I know people. So I go back to my hometown, and basically for about the next 4 or 5 months, at 12 years old, I was bouncing around, living with random people, living with different people, living by myself with some adults sometimes. I was getting to school, coming home, doing all the things by myself, essentially, and which is really hard to think about when you're 10, 11, 12 years old. And I end up at this house of family friends, or well, not family friends. They were just friends of mine that I actually met. I met them through Mondo. I was at this couple's house. And one day I get a phone call. I never got phone calls. So I get a phone call, and they're like, hey, Seth, this is for you. And it's my mom. My mom is calling me to tell me that she's like out of jail or something at this point. And she says, I'm going to come and get you. And I had to tell my mom, I don't want to live with you anymore. I don't want to go back and live with you. I have a family now. Like, these people are taking care of me, and I'm okay. And she, instead of like, I love you and I'm sorry and I forgive you and all of these things, she tells me, like, fuck you, I'm going to come and get you. You're my fucking son. You're my responsibility. This is, bullshit. Like, you can't stay away from me, something to that effect. And so I break down the phone. I'm crying. I'm scared because I don't want to go back and live with my mom. Like, the family I was living with was like a very middle-class family, but we had a mom and a dad in the house. I had siblings, you could say, and I had food on the table every night, So, like, I was happy. And she says all of that. The father sees me crying, so he comes up and asks me what happened. I tell him, and then he immediately offers to adopt me. And I'm like, yes, yes, please do what you can to adopt me. I do not want to go back and live with my mom. And my sisters, I don't know where they were at this point.
You guys were separated?
Yeah, when I left my dad's house, they stayed with him. And then I don't know where they went between those last like 4 or 5 months, So, and during that same time I was living with those people, I was on the phone with Mondo one weekend, because I was at that house, I didn't need to escape anymore. I didn't need to go anywhere, So literally like the 1 or 2 weekends, I didn't go to Mondo's house. I was at their house and I'm talking to Mondo on the phone. He's like, well, why didn't you, want to come up? And I said, well, telling this grown man, I don't need you anymore. I have a family now and I don't need to leave every weekend, I think I'm okay now. Like I don't need to see you as much as I needed before. And this grown man took it as like a teenage girl would take it when a boy says he doesn't want to date her anymore, He's like, well, what do you mean you don't need me? And he knew what he was doing. He starts to play into the game. What do you mean you don't need me? What am I going to do without you? That really hurts that you said that to me. When am I going to see you again? And so I'm on the phone, like trying to defend myself to this grown man about, I don't need to see him anymore, and you can't win that fight. You can't, as a child, you can't win that fight.
You're just not mentally strong enough to do it.
Yeah. There's so much to it and they know what they're doing. They're, like I said, they're master manipulators. And so he convinces me to go to his house again. Right. And so I start going to his house again. And I'd only not gone to his house like 1 or 2 weekends. That was it, and he was already like fiending for it, So I ended up going back to his house, and around that time, this was like around Christmas or right after Christmas, my grandparents find out that I was living with these people, and they come and pick me up. And they had my sisters. I get to their house, and they already had my sisters. So I get to my grandparents' house, and I'm looking at my sisters. I'm like, oh shit, like we finally made it. Like we're all together. We're at grandma and grandpa's house. We're safe now. Like grandma and grandpa are well off. They've got a nice house, warm. We got food, like nice cars, nice clothes, like all of the things. We finally made it, And I was so happy that we were all together. And my grandparents asked to adopt us. They said, hey, do you guys want us to do this? And I said, yes, immediately. My sisters say yes at first, but then after about a week or two of being there, my mom is on the phone with them every night. She's talking to them about, you guys need to come back and live with me. You guys are my kids and it's okay now and this and that. And I've got this together and I love you guys. And I actually never really talked to my mom while I was at my grandparents' house. I didn't feel a reason to talk to her. I didn't want to talk to her. And they convinced my sisters to go back and live with my mom. Or my mom convinces them to go back and live with her. So my grandma takes them, drops them off. She comes back and I stay there as basically an only child now. My grandparents go through the adoption process. During that time, I want to go hang out with Mondo again, So I tell him, I said, well, I have this friend, do you mind if I go hang out with him? And they're like, well, who is it? Well, it's this 30-year-old man, 36-year-old man at this point. And they're like, no, like we're not doing this. They knew what happened to me at 5 when I was molested the first time. And so I'm like, no, he's not like that. I'm defending him. He's not like that. Jacob knows him. My friend Jacob knows him. He can attest to it. He's not like that. So they're like, okay, well, we want to meet him first. So Mondo comes to the house. They meet him. He makes them laugh. He makes them smile, builds some commonality with them. He's in the house again, right? We're back in the saddle, as what I always say. Go back to his house, and the cycle just continues. It goes on for several more years, right? And I'm at a new school now, new kids, and living with my grandparents. So at least Monday through Friday, my life was pretty solid with my grandparents. They took good care of me. But then Friday night, Saturday night, like clockwork, I would go to Mondo's house. And by the time I was about 15 and a half years old, I was about a month away from being 16. So I was almost 16 years old. I'd been going to his house for almost 6 years straight, probably talking on the low end, 300 to 400 occasions of abuse, because I was going to his house every weekend of the year.
Every weekend.
There's 52 weekends in a year. I was probably going 45 to 50 of them.
And you were willingly going.
Yeah.
You were, I gotta go. I gotta be there.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I gotta go hang out with my friend.
Yep. Yeah. And about a month away from being 16 years old, I had a younger friend that was with me that was up at his house. And throughout all this time of knowing Mondo, we hung out with other adults too. And Mondo would make comments about me to these other adults. We'd be in a room with other adults, not my family, but just these friends that we had. And he would say, okay, well, we're going to go back to my house. I got to go back and fuck Seth tonight. Or I got to go back and, Seth's going to blow me tonight.
He would say that out loud.
Yeah. And everybody would just laugh. Everybody's like, ah, like, it's so funny.
But it
was 13, 14,
you were a
15.
Kid.
Yep.
And they're laughing. Like it was a joke, or they knew?
Like it was a joke. It would be the same as me sitting here with my wife and saying, oh, I'm going to go have sex with this lady tonight. You're hiding in plain sight like a wolf in sheep clothing, And I remember him making those comments and those jokes, and it would always make me feel so like sick to my stomach because I'm like.
And you're a little bit older now, so you kind of understand it more than when you were 10 and 11.
Right. And yeah, a lot of people will ask, well, why did you keep going back? Why were you going back willingly? Why did you not say anything? Why did you enjoy it? Like, what was going on? Like, why did you do it? And one of the things that I've kind of discovered recently about all of this shame is associated with it because if I report him, I have to admit that I partook in these activities, right? I have to admit that not only did he perform, oral sex on me, he eventually raped me when I was 13 and rapes me several more times between 13 and almost 16. The touching, all of those things, the kissing, the I love yous, all of the worst things that can happen to a kid. If I report him, I have to admit that those things happen. Therefore, in a way, I was letting it happen, and I'd have to admit that yes, I was there, and those things happened to me, and I did those things. So that's what shame does to you. That's why people, in my opinion and my experience, that's why I couldn't report him, because what am I going? I can't go to school and tell these kids that I did these things. I can't tell anybody that I did this. It's embarrassing. It's shameful. It's disgusting. So I never wanted to report him. I never wanted to say anything. I didn't want to go back, but if I didn't go back, then what would happen? People would question me. Well, why aren't you going back to his house all of a sudden? What happened with Mondo? Because if you stop suddenly, if you have a daughter or a son and they don't want to see your brother anymore, well, wait a minute. Why are you so against going to your uncle's house or your cousin's house? Why are you so against it all of a sudden? Well, that leads to questions. And I knew that, right? I knew that if I didn't go to his house, it would lead to questions like, well, what's going on? Like, why don't you want to go back? Did something happen? And I didn't want to face that, Not only that, but to talk about the first time he raped me at 13, I remember sitting on his toilet afterwards, getting stuff out of my body and crying and thinking to myself, my life is over. I don't have a mom. I don't have a dad. This just happened to me. I don't know when it's going to end. Like, why did all of these things happen to me? Not only that, but do I have HIV? Do I have AIDS? Do I have some sort of disease? Do I have, is there anything wrong with me? Like, I didn't want to. It got to the point where I was so scared to report because I knew that I was going to get my blood tested, and I didn't want to look at the results and see positive for something, I was like petrified. I was just so disturbed and scared of seeing something like that. If I would have seen that paperwork and it would have said, HIV positive, for example, like I would have dreams and nightmares about that, like just that moment, and realizing that my life was over because of those things. Also, people would say, are you gay? Are you gay? Like, you did this with a man. Like, why did you do this? So all of those reasons you don't report, and I had been battling that for years, obviously, but this one weekend in particular, I was up at his house, had a younger friend with me, and I told you about the comments he would make about me, right? Well, I actually have this in the police reports now. I couldn't remember what he had said to this kid that night, but it was in the report. So now I remember verbatim. I can remember him saying it now. We were sitting there. I'm playing on the computer, playing video games, and he says to my younger friend, he says, if you're having a bad day, I can take you back into bed and blow you. It says it right in front of me too, and I'm thinking to myself like, hey man, I know what you're doing. You realize that, right? Like, you played this game with me, like, I know what you're about to do to him. I know you're not joking, and my friend laughs it off, and I kind of laugh it off, and Mondo goes back to his bed, and my younger friend goes back there too. He calls him back there. And this is the first time that I can remember my younger friend going back there. And so I knew that it was going to happen to him, and I couldn't let it happen, So oddly enough, I'm playing the video game. My friend Jacob, who introduced me to Mondo previously, is on the video game as well. And I text Jacob on the game. I said, hey, man, I really need to talk to you tomorrow. Can you come over? He says, yes. That's all he says. Cool. So Mondo comes out of his room suddenly, kind of weird, and he walks over to the computer, and he's like, hey, what are you doing? Who you playing with? And I was like, oh, nobody. I didn't want to tell him I was playing with Jacob, because Mondo would often talk shit about Jacob, saying, Jacob doesn't hang out with us anymore. He's too good for us, kind of those things, So I didn't want to tell him I was playing with Jacob. And thankfully, Jacob doesn't say anything else to me in the video game, because if he would have, the chat would have popped up and Mondo would have seen this. You know what I'm saying? Part of me thinks that he did see a piece of the chat, because the whole room kind of changed. I thought he was going to kill us that night or something, because I feel like he did see something, because he got very quiet. And, nothing really happens. The night goes on. I end up going back to bed with Mondo again. He rapes me again this weekend. And when that happened, that was a Saturday night. I wake up Sunday morning. We go home. Mondo drops me off first, takes my younger friend to his house, which is 20, 30 minutes away into the city. And Jacob comes over. Jacob and I are walking around our property, and we go inside, and I'm in my room, pacing back and forth. I'm like, hey man, I've been wanting to tell you this for a long time. I just don't know how to say this. I don't know what to say or how to say this. And so I just that's all I can say. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to tell you this. I'm just scared, and I'm panicking. And then he breaks it with, Mondo touched you, didn't he? And I fall apart. I fall to the floor, screaming, crying. It's obviously a yes. And so he says, well, he did it to me too. And I look over at Jacob. Mind you, he's like 21, 22 now, something like that. And he's my hero. Like, he's like my bigger brother. He's this guy. He's like, I just love him to death, And so I couldn't believe that it had happened to him. It'd be the same as if your dad told you it happened to him. Like, that's your dad. Like, that's a man. Like, that doesn't happen to him, And that's kind of how I looked at Jacob. And I get up and, we start hugging it out a little bit. And he's like, well, what do you want to do? Do you want to report him, or do you want to keep it a secret? And I said, fuck this guy. We got to report him. I said, he's about to do it to my younger friend. I was like, I'm not going to let this happen to anybody else. So we go tell my grandparents. And, my grandma breaks down. She's horrified, and she's crying. And I felt terrible, because I had defended this guy for so long.
And he had been to the house. They had met him.
Yeah, man. And statistically speaking, over 78% of the time, you will be, or victims of sexual abuse are abused by somebody within their immediate family, i.e. mom, dad, brother, sister. Over 90% of the time, it's by somebody in their circle of trust, whether it's a church member, sport coach, school, family, to that effect. So it's incredibly prevalent. It's not the man in the van. It's somebody that's in your house, or in your family, or in your circle of trust. Most of it, like literally 9 times out of 10, that's who it is that's doing it. So fits the bill for this situation. And we go to the hospital. I remember getting down to the hospital, being in the exam room. Officer walks in, Officer Chad Couples from Bluffton, Ohio. This guy's always going to be a part of my story. I remember him walking in. The reason why he sticks out is because I see his last name. His wife was actually my teacher for several years prior. And so I kind of like, hey, Couples. I'm like, I know you. Like, and I had actually seen him before on like Veterans Day. He would come to the school because he served in Iraq. And so he's like, yeah, like my wife is Miss Couples. And so kind of crazy. His wife was teaching me at the moment of like the height of my abuse with my mom and being molested. And so anyways, we start talking. You know, I have to tell him all these horrific details at 15, almost 16 years old of some shit that I'm not going to say here. Just really, really nasty stuff. And so telling him all the details, and then we go back into the exam room, and the nurse sits down with me, and, there's like 5 people in this room, 5, 6, 7 people in this room. And she puts her hand on my knee, and she says, do you have any dirty clothes? Do you have anything that you've worn to his house recently that hasn't been washed? Or when was the last time this happened, And I'm like, well, this just happened like 15 hours ago. And I have not taken a shower. I've not changed my clothes because I knew I needed this on me. And the silence in the room was deafening because most of the time in this situation, when this happens to somebody, they go home and wash and shower immediately. They want to get the filth off of them, right? And I had gone home. I slept in it Saturday night, gone home Sunday, walked around all day Sunday with his filth on me. And they're just blown away. They're like, holy shit, how the hell did this kid know to not do these things, so we could have his DNA. So they do their like rape kit test thing on me. They find his DNA in my underwear. They find his DNA in parts of my body. And the cop goes up and arrests him that night. And I'll be getting the interrogation videos later this year when I go to Ohio. I've got all the police reports of everything that happened, but I'll be getting the videos later this year, which I'm excited to kind of look at and see how that played out. But he goes up and arrests him that night. He admits guilt to like one incident of oral sex and attempted having sex with me. And that's all he admits to initially. Over the course of the trial and everything like that, this is a big reason why I'm doing what I'm doing and trying to fix some things, is because the prosecutors offered him a plea deal. So he eventually admits guilt to between me and Jacob. In combination between the two of us, about 10 years of molestation and abuse. What's crazy about that too is he ran a haunted house in his hometown of Bluffton on Main Street. So every year he would hand out candy to thousands of kids who would come through his haunted house, probably looking for prospects, right? So he gets charged with 11 felony counts. He takes a plea deal and is only hit with 4 of them. The fact that the prosecutors and the attorneys or the DA or whoever the hell decided that a plea deal was okay blows my mind. I would like to say that these people do not get plea deals, and we need to hammer them with the full extent of the law. You know what I'm saying? He got a 10-year sentence for 10 years of abuse, okay? He got 10 years of free healthcare, TV, lodging, food, and now I'm left to deal with the consequences. You know what I'm saying? He's not dealing with any of this. In fact, 9 years into his sentence, he died in 2019. So his story ended. Mine's kind of still going.
You said you had a younger friend that you started taking to Mondo's with you. Why'd you start taking him?
Yeah, so I think that kid actually knew Mondo before I did, or we met him at about the same time. Mondo worked with that kid's mom at one point. And because we all played video games and we all played D&D, like we all were like kind of interconnected, So that's kind of how he ended up going to Mondo's house.
Oh, so you met him there?
Yeah, I think I met him through Mondo, but he was never allowed to go to Mondo's house alone. He was never allowed to go alone. His parents would always say, if Seth or Jacob is there, you can go. But he was never allowed to go alone.
Why did Jacob knew? Because he had experienced something similar prior, but he took you anyway. Is it a similar thing where, why did it bring you?
I've talked to him about this, and he told me he thought he was the only one, and I thought I was the only one. There was nothing in me that believed that it was happening to anybody else. Nothing. But until I heard what he had said to my younger friend, there was nothing in me that said this is happening to other people, or maybe this happened to Jacob. Nothing. So to that point, Jacob
Probably
to
didn't
my
know.
knowledge, felt the same way. And
Do you think you didn't want to know? Meaning, like you wanted to feel like you're the only one. It kind of makes you feel special that you're the only one, or do you think you just didn't know? I mean, where do you think the psychology around that kind of moment was?
yeah, that's a good one. I I don't know. I don't think I think sometimes I felt special, like not in the sense of being the only one, but just being loved, being somebody cared for me, somebody fed me, somebody, did nice things for me and took care of me. The feeling of love I felt special there, but I never felt, personally, I never felt like I'm the only one he's doing this to, so I'm special. I know that is a thing that does happen, but for me, like that happens a lot with incest when fathers do that to their daughters or mothers and sons and mothers, daughters, whatever. That'll happen a lot with really young kids when they're like 2, 3, 4 years old to the point of they do enjoy it. They will go to their dad seeking out this sexual abuse because that's how they think they're supposed to bond. I never had that. I think I was old enough I knew everything was wrong. I knew everything he was doing to me was wrong. I never enjoyed any bit of it. I hated every moment of it, truthfully. But for me, it was the pizza, the pop, the affection, the ability to relax, not be beat on, not have drugs around me, not a quiet, safe place to sleep, safe, as well.
Perceived safe.
Yeah, perceived safe place to sleep was worth, in my mind, the few minutes of pleasure that I had to give this man, So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. It's a tough one to answer.
I have one final question.
Yeah.
Have you forgiven Mondo?
Yeah, it is what it is, man. Shit happens, and I actually just had a conversation with a girl the other day where she said, I think it was the church is what she was trying to forgive. She said, I'm actively trying to forgive them after all these years, and little by little I'm able to do it, And I said, hey, there's no sense in there's no sense in it. Anger is an active emotion. You have to be actively angry. You can't be angry, I can be content and maybe even happy, but I can't be angry. Like that's a thing that you have to actively put energy towards, and I don't have the energy for that shit. So with that, yeah, I forgive him. And, not to say that forgiveness, I think some people confuse that with innocence. They'll say, I can't forgive that person for what they did. Well, if you're not going to forgive them, don't let it have any power over your life then, like don't let it consume you. He is not who I am. He's a piece of my story. And like I said earlier, not that it's right, and not to defend him, but he was a child at one point and he was an innocent little baby and something happened. And I'd love to know what took him down the path of doing what he was doing. We all have bad thoughts. We all have intrusive thoughts. Some of us act on them and some of us don't, It's really interesting. But yeah, there's no sense in me having or harboring anger and hate towards somebody. And, not to keep talking about Nick, but I'll just tell you real quick. People ask him all the time, are you mad about the situation that you got shot by? Because it was an insider attack. It was people, it was A&A. And he's like, at first, yeah, I was, but, they were just doing what they thought. They were doing their piece of the fight. I was doing my piece of the fight. And that's where it is. When you go to war, if you have an active mindset of anger and rage and you want to kill, which I did when I went, admittedly, it's going to mess you up a little bit, So me and you have opposing views, right? And that's okay. So me and Mondo, we had opposing situations in life. He did what he did. I did what I did. Does he forgive me for reporting him and putting him away? Not that was wrong per se, but, I'm sure he understands where I was coming from, you know, and I can empathize with the fact that he probably had something happen to him that turned him into the monster that he ended up being. I can empathize with that, with what happened and the pieces of that, not with what he did, you know. So forgiveness is not, you know, freedom from what he did. He's still wrong, but there's no sense in me sitting here being pissed off about it.
You are a braver and significantly stronger man than I am. I think it is super encouraging. And if anyone wants to know more about Seth, we will link everything to the bottom so they can find you. And man, I appreciate you sharing. That's amazing. And if anyone's feeling down and if everyone's feeling struggle, if anyone's feeling like, man, I don't know if I can ever get out of it, you're literally proof that anyone can come out of it.